Hi, and welcome to episode number 3 of the RedeeM podcast, where we help you reverse your story. We help you integrate tragedy, redeem heartache, and flourish in life. On this episode, I'd like to talk to you about the redemption process or the redeeming process. Redeem is a very ancient word because it goes back to this idea of slavery, this idea of something is no longer owned or you have lost possession of something. And redeeming means that someone comes and purchases back the property or the person so that they come back into their rightful position of who they were before. So this is very much applicable to slavery, both globally and into the story of the United States. But redemption means to redeem something means to purchase back. And this is exactly what Jesus did in the biblical narrative in coming back to redeem and shed his blood as a payment to purchase us back from evil and from death and from the slavery to sin and wickedness in the fall back into the family of God to experience redemption, to experience being redeemed, to experience newness of life. And redemption is not just about purchasing something back, but it's also about belonging, which is why I think redeeming your story is very, very important. Who will you belong to? Who owns you now? A story that I came across recently that I really moved me inside was the story of Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, and specifically about his conversion in interacting with the bishop. And so I'm going to kind of read a summary of that. Jean Valjean's conversion occurs after his release from 19 years of imprisonment. And in the story, in those 19 years, he was convicted unjustly and then sentenced to an unjust amount of time in prison. And then, because of repeated attempts to escape, his sentence kept on getting longer and longer. And he would experience tremendous abuse at the hands of the police officers. So, after 19 years of imprisonment, he's bitter and hardened by injustice. And as he comes back into society, inns and towns and society and businesses turn him away. They won't help him out because now on his traveling document certificate, it is stamped that he is an ex-convict and he's an undesirable. So there's one character who becomes the guide for Jean Valjean. Bishop Meriel is the only one who accepts him in. And he welcomes him not only with generosity, but also with kindness, which after 19 years is very, very difficult to receive. So, because Jean Valjean has given himself over to belong to his anger and rage at the injustices he has suffered, he repays the generosity of the bishop by stealing the silver dinnerware utensils. And then as he escapes and flees, and then Bishop and his people discover that the following morning, the bishop still has a generous heart towards Jean Valjean. And so he lets go of the silver. But in this wrong, he really has every right to claim punishment against Jean Valjean for this. So the police intercept him as suspicious. What is he doing with all of this silver? And what ends up happening is they come back to the bishop, and the police bring him and is like, hey, we found this guy with all your silver. And the bishop says, no, I actually gave him that silver as a gift. And on top of that, here's some more silver. And the police are dismissed, and Jean Valjean is dumbfounded. He's stunned, and he doesn't know what to do. Because now he's being confronted with grace, something he did not deserve, forgiveness. So Jean Valjean is so stunned, and as he's trying to make sense of what the bishop is doing for him, this is what the bishop says. Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to what is evil, but to what is good. I have bought your soul to save it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. So it was that act of mercy that becomes a transformative moment. It still takes time because there's an inner struggle within Jean Valjean of who he will become. Will he continue to give himself over to evil, or will he continue to belong to a new path where someone has redeemed and purchased his soul to belong to what is good? And I love that story because it reverses the story of evil. It reverses the story of death and destruction. And this is the beauty of the gospel, that where we deserved death and punishment and shame and judgment and condemnation, God, in his mercy and justice through his Son, Jesus Christ, has provided a way for us to be loved, redeemed, purchased back, and brought into a new family in which we will belong to what is good. And I love that story. There are so many stories in the Bible that are about this same idea. One of them is the story of Ruth, which I won't read the whole entire long portion of it, but basically to summarize it is Ruth leaves with, Naomi leaves with her husband and two sons, and they go off and they live in a different foreign land. The two sons take two Moabite wives, and then the father and the two sons all die. And so then the story, the first portion of the story ends with Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, are now widows. So there's a scene in which Naomi separates from her daughters-in-law, and Orpah goes back to her kindred, but Ruth will not leave her. And Ruth says that I will belong to you and I will belong to your God. So they come back to Bethlehem. So they left, Naomi left full, and now Naomi is returning empty and barren. Well, not barren, but childless and a widow. So she has no family, she has no prospects, she's extremely vulnerable and now very demoted in society. So then the story begins to become interesting as Ruth and Naomi are trying to live. Ruth goes off and collects food from the harvesters during the harvest period from a field of a man named Boaz. And as we'll find later on in the story, Boaz becomes a redeemer. He purchases back the land and Naomi and Ruth. And I already kind of gave it all away. But he becomes the redeemer and he purchases them back and gives them fullness again. And Ruth actually participates in the lineage of becoming part of the lineage of what would later become David, King David, who would then become king of Israel, and God would promise King David to always have someone on the throne ruling Israel, and that was ultimately fulfilled in the Son of Jesus Christ, God the Son, Jesus Christ. So that's another story of redemption that I love. And so this is why I want to help people like you, whoever's listening and watching to this, redeem your story, because it's about who you will belong to. Will you belong to stories of death, destruction, and fragmentation and tragedy, or will you belong to what is good? What stories and relationships of your life do you need help reimagining a different ending? What stories do you want reversed? So, on my website, I have shared a story about becoming a pilot that was redeeming a very, very meaningful dream and desire from when I was a kid that unfortunately belonged to tragedy. It belonged to death. But because of the gospel, I got to experience reimagining something new. I got to reimagining that story of becoming a pilot, being redeemed. And now that I fly gliders, there's so much joy and fullness in my heart that story no longer is a tragedy. It has been redeemed because now it belongs to good. I belong to good. So I would invite you to consider imagining what stories of mine do I want to belong to good and not evil? What stories of mine do I want reversed? What stories of mine do I want to be redeemed? And if you don't know, then I would invite you to partner with me. I'd invite you to schedule some time and schedule a complimentary session with me and see if maybe partnering with me and me walking alongside of you is something that you would need to begin imagining and exploring what it would look like for your story to be redeemed.